This is the fourth in the lecture series on modern Japan. Today's topic is Japanese politics. I mentioned in my last lecture on the Japanese economy that the state played a major role in the industrial development, both in the mid-19th century and in the mid-20th century. The state suggests that politics, political leadership, political stability, that these are major factors overall in the performance of Japan. And so today what I'd like to do is take a look at the Japanese political system since the end of the Second World War, and to argue basically that the political system in Japan from the end of the war until, roughly until the 1980s and into the 1990s, played a generally positive role. But that since 1991, since Japan fell into economic stagnation, the role of the political system has not been positive, that it's been negative in many senses because of its failure to adapt and to deal with the major structural problems and challenges facing the Japanese economy and Japanese society. So let me explain why that's the case and in what ways that can be dealt with. First, I'd like to say that Japan has developed over the second half of the 20th century a distinctive political system. It is a system that was based and structured around single-party domination. The Liberal Democratic Party, the LDP, has enjoyed from basically 1955, the year of its inception, until 1992-93, and then a brief interruption at that point, the longest period of domination, single-party rule, in major industrial democracies. And then the LDP led coalition governments from 1994 until 2009, the next 18 years. So 38 years of single-party rule, 18 years of single-party led coalition rule in Japan. Thus, well over a half century of domination by the Liberal Democratic Party. There have been other parties in the world that have had long periods of domination. The Congress Party in India, for example, or the PRI in Mexico. There are also small countries like Singapore, where the PAP, the People's Action Party, have dominated really continuously since the formation of Singapore as a nation state. But among large industrial, mature democracies, the LDP has had the longest run of single-party governance in second half of the 20th century history. In the United States and Western Europe, there is a different model of politics and political parties. It is a two-party model in the case of the United States, a multi-party model in the case of Europe. And in both cases, parties are routinely elected into and out of office. There is a fear in the West of an over-concentration of power in a single political party. And there is a desire for competition, for transparency, for accountability, and that is best achieved through a rotation of power. In Japan, single party there seems to be a preference for single-party rule. That is, a kind of political hegemony with opposition parties there to ensure that there isn't an abuse of power, but basic continuity, predictability, coherence that comes out of single-party governance. In the United States, we have seen periods where a single party has dominated. The period in the United States from 1932, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt became the president and attempted to lift the country out of the Great Depression, to 1952, when President Eisenhower became a Republican president of the United States, a 20-year period from 32 to 52 of Democratic domination, and a Republican period of domination under Ronald Reagan and then George H.W. Bush from 1980 to 1992. But these are relatively brief periods of single-party domination. As I said before, in the United States, there is a preference for political pluralism, for political opposition and competition, separation of powers that is institutionally built into our Constitution. The legislative branch, the executive branch, the judicial branch. And for 21 years out of the past 30 years, we have had divided party rule in the United States. That is, if we had a Democratic president, like the second term of President Clinton, you might have a Republican House or Republican Senate that makes it divided, or President Obama as a Democrat having a Republican-controlled Congress. And so this is a distinctive feature of the American political system, separation of powers and divided government. Now, the advantages of party rotation in power is that there is always an infusion of fresh blood. There is not the danger of an emerging generational power elite or a plutocracy that is governed by only the wealthiest families, or family dynastic politics. And there is a kind of accountability and transparency that is built into a system where parties rotate in power. In Japan, by contrast, because of the domination of the LDP over nearly a half a century, many of the LDP Diet members are or have become second-generation sons or daughters of elderly LDP politicians. And indeed, many of the prime ministers in Japan, several of them, are sons of former prime ministers. Fukuda, Abe, Yoshida are examples. And so in the 1980s, about 45% of all LDP parliamentary representatives in the lower house were second generation, what we call nisei giin, second generation politicians. And traditionally, this number has been anywhere from 25% to 45%, so a quarter to nearly a half of all LDP politicians coming out of the family. You might call it sort of dynastic politics in Japan. The advantages of this kind of rotation of power in the West is that there is a greater focus on policy as a differentiation between parties. Policy differences that divide Republicans from Democrats, for example, are fairly clear. policy differences that divided the LDP within itself even wasn't entirely clear. And now the differences between the LDP and the Democratic Party of Japan are also not that distinct. And so policy differentiation, policy debate, policy-related elections tend to be the byproduct of political systems in which there is an alteration of power. The single-party system and the main features of Japan's political system took shape in the early period of Japan's independence, from 1952 basically to 1960, and then it hardened from 1960 until the end of the century. The basic features of the LDP's entrenchment in power came about under the leadership of Prime Minister Yoshida Shigeru. Prime Minister Yoshida, who was born in 1878 and died in 1967, was a former diplomat from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and is widely thought to be the sort of political godfather, quote unquote, of post-war politics in Japan. He negotiated the peace and security treaties with the United States, which gave Japan independence in 1952. He became the architect of the so-called 1955 system of politics. He was the author of the so-called Yoshida Doctrine, which was the policy sort of blueprint for Japan for most of the second half of the 20th century. And what came about in this single-party LDP-dominated system was a political economy which is still largely in place in Japan in the 21st century and is in the process of being changed. Prime Minister Yoshida is comparable in his role to Chancellor Konrad Adenauer of Germany. Both were critical to the foundations of modern politics in Germany and in Japan. The institutional outlines of post-war politics took place in 1955. In 1955, various small socialist parties united to form one big Japan Socialist Party, the JSP, in 1955. The Liberal Party and the Democratic Party merged together in response to form the LDP, the Liberal Democratic Party. So you had in 1955 the merger of political parties into two big parties. And it looked at that time like there might be a two-party system. The JSP, the Socialist Party, was based on labor unions and blue-collar workers. Many of its members were labor union members or those who were not in the labor unions but sympathetic to labor, including a large number of intellectuals. The basic policy platform of the JSP was opposition to the US-Japan Security Treaty, a preference for neutrality, diplomatic non-alignment, and in some segments of the JSP, passivity, that is, no arms, and in other elements of the JSP, light arms. So the feeling of lightly armed, defense-only security orientation, no alignment with the United States, that is, neutrality with the communist world as well, and an emphasis upon social welfare for policy, the development of a welfare state. The LDP, by contrast, was based upon a much broader support base. The support base included farmers, fishermen, big and small businessmen, many of the services, medical service, postal savings system, construction industry, transportation, and so forth. So there was a coalition of supporters across many sectors of the Japanese economy that supported the LDP in comparison to the JSP, which had its base on labor unions. Of course, the unions were spread across sectors, but they were relegated to one segment of the workforce, which was the labor union segment, the organized labor union segment. For the JSP, even though they were big in 1955, they gradually shrunk in size and declined in power over time. One of the big reasons was that there was, to begin with, a limit to the expansibility of the Socialist Party beyond the labor union base. That's a problem in many of the opposition parties. They are confined to a support base that is one organization specific. Communist Party to the Communist Party, the Komeito to the Sokugakai religious group. There is a kind of one group affiliation to the opposition parties, which makes it difficult to expand the boundaries of their membership. The JSP, because of its restricted support base, had a hard time recruiting election candidates, capable political leaders from segments outside of the labor union. For example, former bureaucrats from the Ministry of Construction or bureaucrats from the Ministry of Industry and Trade or bureaucrats from the Finance Ministry. These bureaucrats had no incentive to join the JSP and run as socialist candidates. Why? Because they had no experience in labor unions, no membership, and even if they had decided to do so, they would have to rise up within the ranks of labor union leaders, which would be difficult. So instead, for them to run in the LDP made a lot more sense because they had expertise in policy making, they had policy networks with big business leaders and small business leaders. They had experience at the local level, in many cases local government officials. And so they could run and win election and provide a level of expertise and networks for the Liberal Democratic Party that no other party could match. So over time, the recruitment of leaders in the case of Japan under this single party rule was one of the reasons why the LDP could win elections and continuously rule for nearly a half century. Many of the ex-bureaucrats were graduates, elite graduates of the University of Tokyo. They were the best and brightest coming out of the law faculty and to a lesser extent the economics faculty. Therefore, it was not surprising that once they entered the LDP, because of their ability, because of their experience, because of their knowledge, and because of their networks, they rose within the ranks and became prime ministers. And it's fascinating to see that since Yoshida Shigeru, ex-bureaucrat, you had a chain of Yoshida disciples who were ex-bureaucrats and prime ministers. Ikeda Hayato, Sato Eisaku, Fukuda Takeo, and Ohida Masayoshi. These are some of the big names of former bureaucrats that had a major impact on politics and policy in Japan, who came out of the ranks of the bureaucracy. The JSP and opposition had no such access to this talent pool of leaders. And they had no capacity to expand beyond the limits of their limited, restricted support base group. The other aspect of the 1955 system was the Yoshida Doctrine. This is a set of policy guidelines that became institutionalized in post-war Japan. First, reliance on the United States-Japan Security Treaty, in contrast to the socialists who opposed it. And this reliance would become institutionalized in the sense that not only did the treaty get extended and extended and extended, but also defense spending was limited to 1% of GDP. And this was more or less institutionalized in budget making in Japan. And to Prime Minister Yoshida, there was a trade-off between spending, say, 3% of your GDP on defense and spending the 1% and putting the extra 2% GDP into economic development and growth. And he felt that in the 1950s, at least, Japan didn't have the leeway to devote its capital and manpower into the defense sector, and indeed felt that really growth could be achieved best by investment in the civilian sectors, the private sector of the economy. Now, the Yoshida Doctrine allowed Americans to maintain military bases in Japan. In the occupation period, the number of military bases was over 1,500. That number has shrunk considerably in the post-war period, but there are still important bases, especially concentrated in Okinawa. So in exchange for relying on the US for Japan's security, Japan has allowed the United States to operate and maintain bases, particularly in Okinawa. The target of the Yoshida Doctrine, as expressed by Prime Minister Ikeda in 1961, was income doubling, was high-speed economic growth. And this was not just rapid growth, but it was rapid, heavy manufacturing growth. That is, Japan had a choice in the early 1960s. It could either grow through a light manufacturing route, that is, textiles, small machinery, fashion, services, or it could grow through steel industry to shipbuilding industry, caterpillars, and heavy construction and assembly, automobiles. And the choice was pretty clear. Japanese LDP leaders felt that the heavy manufacturing route to industrialization was the best long-term route for Japan to grow. Why? Because through heavy manufacturing, Japan could get a full set of industries, which would give it full employment and the opportunity to enjoy a standard of living that was equal to the West. And that was really what they aspired to have, a full set of industries that provided full employment and a very comfortable Western standard of living in Japan. So this Yoshida Doctrine, which was fine-tuned and developed over time, but basically focused on alignment with the United States and rapid economic growth, became the kind of orientation of Japan for more than 40 years. And the LDP, because of the success of its policies, became the dominant party from 1955, basically until 2009. The JSP, the Socialists, became a permanent opposition party. It was not able to expand, and there was an erosion of its membership base because the labor unions over time shrunk in size and declined in power. And for the Japanese people at large, this 1955 system that was developed and institutionalized provided material benefits of rapid growth. Households, as I said in my last lecture, enjoyed rapid growth of disposable income. And at one point in Japan, in the 1980s, 90 to 92% of the respondents of a public survey said that they saw themselves as middle class, quote unquote, middle class, about 90%. So that the standard of living was based on rising per capita income, growing and expanding accumulated wealth and assets, such as home ownership, and all the comforts of modern living, cars, homes, clothes, travel, food, etc. And there was growing social welfare coverage in Japan, starting in the late 1950s and going through the 1970s. Japan implemented a universal healthcare system where all the Japanese people would be covered by healthcare insurance. It has a large social security and welfare system. And so the Japanese voters tended to support the LDP because they had the comforts of living, a pretty high sense of contentment and security, and there was not a huge amount of disgruntlement about their lifestyle or standard of living. For the socialists, being an opposition party, being permanently out of power, was a vicious cycle, because once you're out of power and the government, the party in power, uses all the full instruments of power to consolidate their hold on power, it's very difficult to break into that circle of power. So over time, the JSP developed an image, a brand name of permanent opposition. And voters came to see the socialists and other opposition party representatives as lacking the experience, lacking the know-how to really govern effectively. So there was a kind of reinforcing quality to being an opposition party in a system in which the single party utilized all the powers of incumbency to solidify its own hold on power. Now let me point out at the same time that over the course, really going back to 1960, 1958, there has been a slow erosion in the base of LDP voter support. That is, the LDP base of support has been heavily reliant on farmers, the agricultural sector. And as the farming sector has shrunk over time from maybe 40% of the population in 1947 to less than 5% today, that shrinkage of farmers has meant that the voter base for the LDP has shrunk. And so if you look at the data of voters and voter support for the LDP over time, you see a steady decline of LDP voter support since 1958, 1960. And how was it that they maintained themselves in power when their support base was eroding and the number of votes they received was eroding? Well, the LDP managed to maintain themselves in power by bringing into being and maintaining a system of electoral districting that was very much in their favor. We call that in the West gerrymandered districting, where you put in place districts that are favorable to your candidates. And so in the case of Japan, the rural and the semi-urban areas are favorable or were favorable to the LDP. So they were heavily overrepresented in the voter landscape. And a vote in, for example, Tottori or Shimane prefectures of a farmer would be, say, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times bigger, that is, have more clout, than a vote of a city dweller in one of the districts in Tokyo or Osaka. And so this misrepresentation, this electoral districting distortion is one of the reasons why the LDP was able to maintain itself in power for such a long period of time. And there have been questions about the constitutionality of one vote, one citizen of this electoral system. And there have been fine-tuning done over the years, but basically the system of overrepresentation of rural and semi-urban districting continues today. Now, the 1955 system also featured centralized power. Centralization of power focused on the LDP working in close conjunction with the central bureaucracies. These are the bureaucracies that do the day-to-day policy formulation and implementation work of the Japanese economy. Ministry of Finance, MITI, Ministry of Industrial Trade and Industry, the Ministry of Construction, etc., Ministry of Transportation. So the LDP was in control of this highly centralized system until 1989, when it lost control of the upper house, the House of Councilors in the Japanese Diet. In this centralized system, interest groups, as I mentioned before, there was a kind of grand coalition of interest groups, which included big business, small business, medium-sized business, doctors and farmers and so forth. They provided support for the LDP in the form of donations, financial donations, and mobilization of voters during elections. And in return, the LDP provided favorable public policies, including earmarks, or what we call earmarks, spending designated for certain districts in the Japanese electoral system. There was a constant recycling of support between the LDP and the supporting interest groups. As I mentioned in my last lecture on the economy, consumers were not the primary focal points or targets of public policy. And in contrast to the United States or Great Britain, where consumers and the concept of consumer sovereignty is central to policies that are made, in the case of Japan under this 1955 system, it was really a pro-producer orientation, pro-corporation, and a pro-state orientation. And this pro-state orientation is seen in the recruitment of former bureaucrats into the LDP, and becoming prime ministers and leading figures on cabinets. And the former bureaucrats who went on retirement from the bureaucracies would parachute, what they call amakudari, into a variety of powerful and lucrative positions in the private sector or the government sector. Finance officials went into many public corporations for finance or private banks. Officials from the Ministry of International Trade and Industry parachuted into high-level executive positions in corporations, manufacturing and assembly corporations. So this stickiness of bureaucracy and the LDP, bureaucracy and interest groups, and the triad, the triangle of governance, LDP, bureaucracy, interest groups, private sector, this really was the main feature of this single-party LDP-dominated system. And it featured the relative weakness of local governments. Local governments in places like the United States or France or Germany, compared to the case in Japan, prefectures in Japan, have more power, more resources at their disposal. In this case, in Japan, it was a highly centralized system of power and policy making. Taxes were collected by the central government. Then part of those taxes were recycled to local governments by the central government, and thus local governments were dependent on the central government for their financing of local government expenditures. Now, this system, as I said, was in place for a very long period of several decades. And one reason why it was maintained was because there was a powerful forward momentum of economic growth from the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s. And this powerful momentum consolidated the structure of single-party governance in Japan. And there were powerful groups that came into power, but I should point out that it was not a kind of absolute system or a corrupted system of domination. There were normative limits placed upon the exercise of majority power. And so the expectation socially, culturally, politically, was that there would be consultation between the LDP and opposition parties, that the minority opposition parties would have a voice in policy making, that there would not be ramrodded in the parliament, and there were a complex set of rules and norms put in place for negotiations between political parties to ensure that the minority parties, the opposition parties, were not ignored or completely overlooked. As a result of this system, not only did Japan grow very rapidly to become the second largest economy in the world, it was the first country really in Asia to take its place in the international system as a nation that decoupled economic growth, economic power from military power and diplomatic domination. This decoupling was a specific decision made by Prime Minister Yoshida and his disciples, and it was the first time in history that a country has systematically and consciously separated the military from the economic domains. And as a result, the neighbors in Asia who saw the the revival of Japan into an even bigger industrial power in the second half of the 20th century than in the first half were able to accept it because Japan did not pose a military threat to their own national security. And Japan abided by the laws and norms of the international system as a good world citizen. So this structure, this one single party dominant structure, really from 1955 until roughly 1985, was a positive force in the revival of Japan and its place as the second largest economy. But there were long-term costs and consequences as well. The costs included dependence on the United States for its national security, and the cost of security dependence was beyond the military area. It meant that Japan would adopt a very cautious and relatively muted voice in the international system. Japan was reluctant and remains reluctant to disagree with or diverge from American positions in the international system. And Japan as a nation, in some senses, not only decoupled economic power from military power, but economic power from diplomatic power as well. Very cautious, very risk averse. The single party system also meant that there was less political competition, less transparency, less accountability than would have been the case had there been a two-party system or any kind of alteration of power. Key decisions about who is going to become prime minister, who is going to be on the cabinet, what are the policies going to look like, were formulated in smoky backroom sessions away from the light of the media or transparency. And so there was a level of unaccountability that took place in this political system. And over time, the success of the 1955 system meant that it grew big and entrenched and incapable of easy adjustment, change, reform, reorientation. There is an inertia built into this system now that is a dead weight and makes it very difficult for change, for Japan's political system to adapt to the rapidly evolving circumstances of Japan's economy and the international system. Indeed, today, 2012, the political system, like many other industrial democracies, is deadlocked. It's gridlocked. It's tough to get anything done. And the institutions are deeply entrenched. There's little flexibility or degrees of freedom for policy change or reinforcement. And over time, as the economist Manker Olson has pointed out, if a political party has stayed in power for a long period of time, say 12 years, what happens is that there is a rigidification of politics and of economic policy. And what's worse is that interest groups that are affiliated with that party in power penetrate the political economic system, and they get favors in terms of favorable public policy, good tax treatment, for example, subsidies, loose regulatory control, etc. They get those goodies from the political economy, and over time, these parasites, these interest groups parasite, eat into the vitality of the economic system, and as a result, economic growth rates decline. And Manker Olson shows with data this kind of decline, which took place in Western Europe and the United States, he could include Japan in that group as well, in which interest groups have come to feast upon the goodies that come out of economic growth. So economic rigor mortis is a problem that Japan has had to deal with in the 1990s and into the 21st century. In Japan's case, this long period of single-party governance has remarkably not generated the corruption, the level of corruption, and the abuse of power that you see in many other countries. Yes, it has produced a kind of a family of political leaders, nisei giin, generational leaders, but the corruption and abuse of power has been much more muted in the case of Japan. What has been more problematic for the economy has been the interest group penetration and expropriation of benefits for these specific interest groups. This means that there has been an erosion of the collective good, a decline of doing what's good for the nation as a whole in this political system. And it's a generic problem, I think, to industrial democracies. The Democratic Party of Japan, DPJ, came into power in 2009 in a landslide victory over the LDP. The Japanese voters were eager to embrace change. They were eager to see 2 decades of stagnation come to an end. They wanted to see the economy put back on a sound footing. But the DPJ has not, so far at least, met the expectation of the voters. It came into office without a lot of policymaking experience. It marginalized the bureaucracies on which the LDP had relied for policymaking, and it really put nothing in place to serve as the source of bureaucratic expertise for its own governance. And so as a result, the Japanese political system has been, again, in some difficulty in confronting the serious structural economic problems of the 21st century. So, what are the general issues as the political system looks ahead? Well, as I said before, we have probably what can be called a crisis of political leadership in industrial democracies. There is a void of leadership. And as I said in my last lecture on the economy, in times of economic hardship, such as those that we've experienced in the world since 2008, electoral politics, the worst features and incentives of electoral politics seem to spring forward. That is, a focus on the part of political parties on what's good for them, what will get them reelected, rather than what's good for the country, what's necessary in terms of difficult decisions for the long-term health of the political economy. And the problems are seen across almost all industrial economies. Soaring deficits, citizens unwilling to accept higher taxes, citizens calling for a cut in spending but unwilling to accept them if it hits them, partisan polarization and demagoguery, outright partisan warfare in many of the countries, elected representatives who only seek their own re-election over all other priorities, political parties that are focused on wresting power from other parties, ideological rigidity, policy gridlock, media amplification and distortion of information, and a general political inability to tackle pressing economic problems and crises, an unwillingness to take painful steps, and instead a search for short-term palliative solutions, band-aid solutions, not serious surgeries. And in particular, after the world suffered a severe financial crisis in 2008, 2009, the world still is struggling to deal with the reverberations and the impact of that financial implosion. It usually takes 3 to 5 years for economies to recover from banking crisis. This last banking crisis was so big, it may take 5 to 7 years. And then during those years, banks have to become healthy again. Private corporations have to repay their debt. And consumers have to be confident enough in the future of the economy and their work that they begin spending. So we have those serious problems for all industrial democracies to deal with. In the case of Japan, these problems were exacerbated. They were dealt with early on, much earlier than the United States or Western Europe. They were dealt with in 1991 through 2008, 2009. In 1985, the political leaders allowed the bubble to reach massive size, the speculative bubble in real estate. And they delayed in acting on banking reforms. And what they did, and they did some reforms, but it was too little and too late. So this is a situation where Japan needs to deal with the legacy of its own national problems within the context of an uncertain, volatile, international environment. And this is not going to be an easy task. The DPJ, the Democratic Party of Japan, came into office in 2009 with a mandate for change. But unfortunately, the focus, their early focus of the DPJ was on the Okinawa military base issue. It was not a prioritization of economic issues. And so there was a diversion of time and energy into security problems, a waste of an opportunity to deal effectively with long-term economic problems. And then you had the March 11th earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear meltdown, which has compounded the issues facing the Japanese economy. But it has created a sense of national crisis, and the political leaders in Japan have not been able to seize upon this sense of crisis and direct it towards the solution of economic challenges. So, looking ahead, the question is, does Japan have the political leadership necessary to bring Japan to the next phase of its economic development? We saw that clear, stable leadership in Japan from 1955 to basically to 1990, 4 decades almost of catch-up, enabled Japan's economy to flourish. This system featured a division of labor between the LDP, the bureaucracy, big business, and other interest groups. And it had a leeway for rapid economic growth. But over time, there was put in place a kind of institutional inertia that is now proving very difficult to overcome. And the question is, will the Japanese political system, now under the leadership of the Democratic Party of Japan, will this political system be able to meet the challenges of the economy, of society, an aging demography and shrinking demography? This is the big issue that faces Japan.